Welcome to another episode of Cosmic Echo, a tailored podcast. This podcast applies a scientific viewpoint in the strange and bizarre phenomenon that happens in our lives when we sleep in altered states. In this episode of Cosmic Echo, we speak with Adam Elenbaas about his book Fishers of Men, the Gospel of an Ayahuasca Vision Quest, and we also talk about his background and how he got involved with ayahuasca. Originally from Minneapolis, Minnesota, Adam is the founder and director of Nightlight School of Astrology and co-founder of Sky House Wilderness, located in Washington, D.C. Adam is a contributing editor of RealitySandwich.com and holds an MFA and MA in creative writing in English. If you would like to learn more about Adam, as well as his work with ayahuasca and his book, please visit our website at taileaters.com/CE podcast, and additionally, you can support our podcast through the same link. Well, without further ado, let's get to the interview.
Adam, how are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me, guys.
So, can you explain a little bit about your book and your background?
Sure. I should explain a little bit of the background, I guess, maybe first. I grew up in sort of Midwest Christian evangelical church. I was a preacher's kid. And my book is sort of, Fishers of Men is basically a coming-of-age story that both explores my background in the sort of rural Midwest Minnesota countryside with a preacher who's an evangelical minister, from my father, and just kind of exploring the dynamic of growing up in the church as a preacher's kid, and then as I grew older, just the ways in which I went through sort of the typical rebellion that people go through, but mine was very religious in nature, and so the story of my book is a sort of spiritual coming of age, memoir. You might think of like Jim Carroll's The Basketball Diaries. I had a couple of critics that sort of compared my story as like a sort of spiritual psychedelic version of like The Basketball Diaries or something like that. So I grew up with a strange mix of sort of Christianity, and my father was inspired to be a Christian minister because of his psychedelic experiences in the early 70s. And so, he was an incredibly liberal, kind of closet universalist, evangelical Christian minister. And I think my dad is, as a character in the book, is sort of typical of a lot of the weird hybrid, cultural manifestations that came out of the late 60s and early 70s. It's not quite totally liberated from the dogma of the evangelism of the Christian church, but it's progressed somewhat. And so my book, it really explores being the next generation down and inheriting some of that confusion. And really my pathway to exploring that ended up being, first, I rebelled from my father and became like a super fundamentalist Christian and like just explored all the different places in Christianity. It's a it's a good way to piss your dad off when your dad's a preacher. But then then it kind of unraveled into more of the drugs and addiction and just recklessness, and then I spiraled into a sort of return to the same roots that my father had. That had opened his journey into the spiritual world, which was psychedelics. And so the book really opens up into the psychedelic realm and specifically journeys to South America to drink ayahuasca and how, I had these visions of Jesus and visions of my background in the church, and just how I kind of started doing some generational work for my dad, for myself, and so it's just a crazy book. I love it. It's got all sorts of interesting topics woven in it. It's a chronological narrative, so it's different than a lot of books about ayahuasca because it's not anthropological. It's not attempting to be a sort of objective exploration of a cultural tradition or anything like that. It's a chronological narrative of my life. And woven in and out of the chronological narrative are scenes from ceremonies where the medicine and the visionary space is interacting with the traditional coming of age, plot line. So I guess that's a bit about it.
Can you talk more about your father and his early experiences?
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, so he grew up in rural, northern Michigan, and as a kid, he was the son of a sort of shell-shocked Korean War veteran, and just inherited like that sort of post-traumatic stress, alcoholism, physical abuse, scene that a lot of veterans were putting their kids through after the wars. And so one of his escape methods was he was a really romantic, he's always been a very romantic thinker, I guess. And so he would escape, out into the woods with his friends, and a number of his friends were Pontiac Native Americans. And so he grew up with their sort of their culture, of course, was dying really rapidly, and a lot of, he was exposed to sort of alcoholism of the, and some suicide attempts, and some of his friends dying, but he fell in love with the Native American culture, while at the same time he was being raised on the one side with his father, and on the other side his mother was a Christian fundamentalist, and so he also had this mix of Native American mythology, and he would collect like feathers, and he was building teepees with his friends, and they were kind of quote unquote like playing Indian, but for as much as it was play, it also, it was a romanticized, exploration of Native American mythos. I think it came from a place of really being disconnected to like positive male figures, and just looking for ways of becoming an adult. So, cutting your hands with knives and becoming blood brothers and all this stuff, as kind of cheesy and cliched as it was, I know for my dad it was sort of it was very real too. So he kind of grew up with that, and then in the early 70s, when he was in college, he was working for the State Department of Natural Resources, and he was a fisherman. He liked to fish, and he was helping to repair trout habitats on the Manistee River in Michigan. And as he was, spending a lot more time in nature, and even thinking of being a park ranger or whatever, he started having these psychedelic experiences with LSD and mushrooms and other things. And basically, like a lot of people around that era, the late 60s, early 70s, just had a consciousness expanding breakthrough through these plants and acid and stuff, and from there, I think he just he felt like the entire Christian paradigm was about compassion and forgiveness and charity and love, and the brotherhood of men and women everywhere, and sisterhood, and he went into the ministry not with a big evangelical bent, like to save people's eternally damned souls or something, but more as like almost closer to like liberation theologians who get into church work from more of a social more for like a social mission, so that was how he got into the church, was sort of wanting to be a progressive reformer of Christian values. But of course, what came with that for my dad was having to play the game, because you have a church filled with, it's like politicians that make promises and that have visions of reform, and then they end up having to play the game in order to stay in the game. And that's where things get compromised. And that's where my dad really, throughout his career, got incredibly burnt out, and I watched his ministry really go into some pretty dark places.
So what was that like growing up in that environment for you?
Well, it was confusing because my dad never really he never really articulated it. He never really would come out and say like I'm a reformer or I mean it was all kind of stuff that I had to piece together myself because kind of like his father. I mean, he wasn't abusive, but my dad just didn't talk to me. He didn't talk to really anyone outside of his job as a minister. He was very private, I guess you could say, about his feelings and his thoughts. And so I just grew up like watching my dad as this public figure, but I didn't really get what motivations were. So, I mean, I remember just feeling like I was, was always felt like his sermons were like riddles, and like watching him in public was like trying to connect to him. What was also like trying to discern what the teachings were that he was offering people, because behind, if I could figure that out, then I could figure out who my dad was. So it was frustrating, interesting. I learned a lot about public speaking and writing and all that kind of stuff just by trying to figure him out.
So, can you actually tell us a little bit about your educational background and your relationship to Reality Sandwich?
Oh, sure. Yeah. So, well, I kind of had I did my bachelor's degree at a private Baptist school, and this was part of my initial rebellion. My father had a extramarital affair when I was in high school, and he had been, slowly he had been like getting promoted to like bigger and bigger churches. And so we were at this big, huge church in the suburbs of Minneapolis in high school, and he had this affair, and I found out about it, and I was the only one in my family that knew. And, it was like he was becoming more and more this like super popular, sort of universalist reformer preacher. And I saw this other side to him that seemed, confused, and his ethics were obviously questionable. And so at the exact same time, like literally like within weeks of this happening, President Clinton was, getting all of the attention about his affair and lying to the American people about it. And I felt deeply betrayed by liberalism in general, just like my democratic universalistic father and all of this stuff. And my rebellion was to go off to the Baptist church across town. and after that happened, I ended up going to a Baptist college too. And the whole like being Baptist thing was really eye-opening. I mean, what I came out with was like, man, I'd rather live with a kind of imperfect father and learn how to forgive him than I would spend my time in a paradigm, at least through the Baptist denomination, that is so focused on the sort of inherent, downward spiral of life in the universe, and that it all needs saving and it's all sort of damned. And forgiving my dad was easy compared to dealing with that. But I guess so. After I left the Baptist college, I went back to the same school that my dad had gone to for his undergrad, and I did a master's degree there in Michigan in creative writing. And what was interesting about that was that the way that I made my way to that, I got to the school in Michigan to do my master's degree basically because I had a complete sort of drug-induced breakdown trying to live on my own after college. I left the Baptist college and was disillusioned and hadn't quite forgiven my father, but didn't know where I was going, and I got really addicted to opiates and all sorts of stuff. And my dad kind of came and saved me, and said, look, we've got this cottage in Michigan on this land. It's near my alma mater, and if you want, you could go back to graduate school and like live in the cottage and just kind of get your shit together. And so I did, and that began a healing journey for me and my father and my family and myself. And after my master's degree, I went down and did an MFA in Georgia in creative writing again. throughout that whole process, I'd come to find ayahuasca and was doing a lot of healing work with the medicine down in Peru. And after that, I was writing a book at that point about the experiences. And then as soon as my MFA program finished up, I had met a guy in the jungle who basically set me up with a job here in New York City. And somewhere in there in my MFA program, Reality Sandwich had started up. And of course, I had read Daniel Pinchbeck and just immediately contacted him saying, I'd love to write for you guys. And so, day one launch, I was there writing news shorts, and within a year or so came and spoke at the ayahuasca monologues about my dad and about this whole journey. And it just kind of evolved from there little by little. But I've been helping out with RS since for day one.
So, in speaking about opiates, I mean, can you talk a little bit about how you were introduced to opiates?
Well, yeah, it's funny. Like the first opiate that I ever had really was because when I was in college at this Baptist school, I broke my arm playing football, and of which it was really funny because I was like really trying to be like, one of God's men, and like God's men like read the Bible and like go to worship services and smash each other playing football and like join the Republican Party. It was all this, and I even voted for George Bush. I know it's terrible, but it's like really, really, I broke my arm really bad playing football and was exposed to opiates for several weeks afterward. And Radiohead's Kid A had just come out, and I was like, high school was like, I was really, even though I was kind of going through this sort of fundamentalist Christian thing, some of my good friends, smoked pot and drank. And so, I had been getting into like sort of outside of my religious rebellion, I was also starting to drink and smoke. And but I remember like here, my arm was broken, my wrist was paralyzed, and I was souped up on like Oxycontin with, Kid A in my hands. Basically I remember just being like, wow, like just feeling so disembodied from like, my dad, my church, my religion. And the funny thing was that for such a Christian community that's supposed to be full of like stewards and people helping at the school, like nobody would help me like get to my physical therapy appointments. It was like, and my family had moved to Michigan. So I was basically alone at this college. And it was really eye-opening to realize that like, well, if I can play football and like, get good grades and wear like my Jesus shirt and attend the Bible studies, I'm good. But as soon as I became a kind of gimpish figure, there was no, like nobody wanted to help me. It was really incredible. And there was a lot of kind of like, well, pull yourself up by your own bootstraps type of stuff. And I just like was like, wow. And it was so obviously socioeconomic. Like these people had way more money and were just sort of, a lot of them were kind of spoiled. I'm painting kind of a rotten picture. There were a lot of I had some really great friends there too. But at any rate, that was kind of my first run-in with opiates. And ever after, if, I ever ran into people who were like, oh yeah, I've got some Vicodin. You want to take some with your pipe or whatever? I would be like, oh yeah, give me, I love that. And it just kind of became a problem little by little.
Would you say that opiates were, I don't know how to say this, the first drug that you fell in love with?
Well, I mean, I'd say marijuana. Marijuana, alcohol, and cigarettes I had been dipping around with since I was like 16, and it was weird. It was like, compartmentalization. Like here I was going to the ultra fundamentalist church, but then I always had a connection to a dad who smoked cigars, drank a little scotch, like, had feathers hanging around, like, and my friends too. Some of my friends were always smoking pot, and so I'd say the first thing I fell in love with was probably, just alcohol and marijuana and cigarettes. I would say like something that I got more addicted to, like had like a codependent relationship with, would have been at first Vicodin and then Oxycontin and methadone. There's some morphine too. It was pretty brutal.
So how did you get from opiates to ayahuasca?
Well, I mean, I think like it was just sort of a haze of like it turned into basically just like you know, oh my God, I just wanna get as high as possible, as often as possible, and like listen to music and have sex and party and just whatever. And I think as I started to grow older, like what I noticed was that I started feeling paranoid, like socially. I started, like, the drugs no longer really felt good. I started to feel paranoid. Like there was too many life experiences that were racking up that would start to, that weren't exactly positive, that would start to dialogue with any kind of fun I was trying to have, like, my dad was getting really depressed, and so it was hard for me to party. And, anyone mentioned like, oh, this is a cool place. You live here. Your parents let you live here. And even the mention of my parents would have me starting to think about my dad's mental health, or, so it's just like anything that was normally fun was starting to come with like the more like a stronger gravitational presence of like my pain. And so pot smoking seemed to do something different. It seemed to, I didn't want to be around anybody when I smoked anymore. Doing opiates was something that I did more to avoid anxiety, like in my chest, in my throat. Like it just changed. Like the nature of everything sort of changed. And I had never done anything, any kind of psychedelic other than, smoking pot. Alcohol was starting to give me real problems. I noticed that I was like, just to be totally, this is probably too much information, but, I was having like
that's fine.
blood in my, bowels, and like, just like feeling like, literally feeling like I was hurting my kidneys and my liver. And like, I started to get MRSA. There are these like really brutal staph infections.
Wow.
And I could just feel that like something wasn't right. And so I even like a couple of times had like major freakouts with marijuana, where like I would like need to like go hide somewhere when people were around, and like, just kind of weird stuff. So eventually one night I had a friend offer me some mushrooms, and I thought, okay, well, this will be fun. I'm just going to get high or whatever. And I ended up sort of locking myself into my bedroom for an entire evening and just having one of the most deeply therapeutic, like, love yourself, love the universe. Like it was like the best possible thing I could have ever asked for. I was like, it was really shocking too. I was looking at, I always tell this story. I was like looking at my CD collection and being like, oh, all the music that I have in my entire life is based around me trying to compete with my father, or like this, all of my choices of clothing are based on a fear of certain colors on the spectrum that represent certain emotions that I can't express. And so I started, putting on all sorts of different clothing items that didn't feel like I was attractive enough to wear. Like I'd buy a shirt that showed my muscles a little bit more or something, and then be like, I can't ever wear that because that doesn't look good or something. And so I was putting on like layers of, like repressed clothing and just doing all this crazy stuff. And my friends were really worried because I had like locked myself in. And I was like, no, don't be, I'm being reborn in here. Everything is totally fine. And it just sort of really cracked me open. And then it was like little by little after that, like a, in my book, I say something like, it was like a window had been opened in the night. And if you were sweating in your sleep, then it's just that instant realization as you feel that first lick of breeze that like, I don't have to move and wake up and like, go freak out and take a nice cold shower because a small breeze has entered and I know that my body's going to now start to cool down. And there's this relief that you can feel even though you know that the breeze that's entering still has to go through a process of cooling the entire room and your body. And that's how I felt. I just felt like something had entered my life that was beginning a process, like I was being healed. And it was just little by little, like that very night after the end, and I was kind of in the mushroomy glow afterward, I found, like for the first time, it dawned on me that my dad's bookshelf in this cottage I was living in was filled with like Carlos Castaneda and all these people. And I was like, oh my God, you know, like this is why my dad is kind of the way he is. He's had some of these experiences too. And you know, little by little that led me to, you know, I had several experiences, you know, kind of Terence McKenna all of a sudden became like a big centerpiece of my life. And I would listen to like, you know, 4,000 hours of Terence McKenna. Wow. You know, could repeat any piece of his rap on any of his subjects or whatever. And then it was kind of became like, okay, well, I had some psychedelic experiences on my own. Like I became a bit of a Clint Eastwood, like Terrence, and not all of them were positive. Some of them were incredibly terrifying. And I realized, oh, there's this other dimension. I don't know, the astral, or people call it different things, but I just recognized that like it's, you know, I had like found myself in like the tributaries of some incredible, you know, river of another dimension, but was sort of like without a paddle. And like I was really drawn to the idea of finding a shaman, and at least I could experience some form of traditional ancient leadership in this dimension, so that I could, you know, my thought was, well, I'll just get that and then I'll come back and I'll like know how to do it. Yeah. And it was, you know, of course I got my ass completely kicked. So you know, and I still do. So but yeah, that opened the world for the ayahuasca.
Yeah. So can you tell us actually a little bit about going to Peru, and what was the shaman like there for you?
Well, you know, it's funny because when I went, I was expecting there was an American shaman who had this lodge, and he had a teacher that he had studied with. So it was supposed to be like him and his teacher. And when we got down there, it turned out that his teacher was in prison.
Oh no.
His teacher was in prison for having brewed a batch of ayahuasca for some tourists who then tried to smuggle something, like it was like another form of drug or something that they tried to put within and so he got wrapped up in it, and you know, sort of guilty until proven innocent. About a year later, he finally got out of jail. So this shaman actually spent like a year in prison, you know, and for something he totally didn't do. I mean, well, he brewed the ayahuasca. It was probably kind of stupid of him to brew it for, you know, just some gringos to take home. But
yeah.
But at any rate, so it was just us and this American who had completed his formal apprenticeship and turned out to be an incredibly masterful shaman. But it was complex to like initially have my first experiences with like you know, a white guy from California.
Yeah.
So I was like kind of disappointed, but at the same time, it was this beautiful lesson about like, you know, the sort of demystifying what the medicine does for people, which is to, I think anyway, is to like undo all of the binaries of our mind. So like exotic medicine, brown skinned people, jungle, they own it. This is theirs. I'm the exotic foreigner who's like traveling to have this. Well, like that whole narrative of like what I was there to do and who these people were and what got completely deconstructed when like, you know, I see this California guy and I'm all disappointed about him. But then an hour into the ceremony, he's turned into like a 30-foot condor and is like, you know, taking us through some mythic dimensions of like, you know, my, you know, past life regret. I mean, whatever. It was so far out that I couldn't even. I came away just being like, all right, so I like apparently, you know, all of my childhood fantasy realms like Middle Earth and Narnia and all these places are like totally alive and well, and you can visit them and they interact with our world. And so yeah, it just became like this this intense study about meaning, and it just deconstructed the whole like race, culture, foreign, other, exotic, like I mean, I was exposed to the mythos of like Christianity, of like Greek mythology, of Native American consciousness, of Eastern consciousness. I mean, any paradigm you could think of was kind of covered within the visionary mandala of the experience. So it was not like limited to like, spider monkeys and dolphins, like, swimming in my ear and teaching me the secrets of like the rainforest. It was like, covering, the medicine was hyper intelligent, like way beyond the location that it grows in, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Did you have, I'm just curious, did you have any sort of shared visionary experiences where people were experiencing multiple people having sort of the same vision or similar visions?
Yeah, well, one of the things in particular that was kind of fun was, there would be certain, like, when certain Icaros are sung, and I mean, even in, like, the Santo Daime, when certain Hinarios are sung, they're like these, they're like collections of downloaded spiritual hymns. And the same thing with the Icaros. They're like, they invoke certain mythical dimensions and certain themes that the psyche then sort of grapples with. And as it slowly disentangles itself, from all sorts of entrapments, like in the material world, like wealth and love and all of these kinds of things. And so they might call in a song of like the pink river dolphin. It might be a song about that. And you might see pink river dolphins, and everyone is talking like, wow, look at the dolphins. Do you see the dolphins? And like lots of people will be pointing them out loud. Sometimes psychically you can talk to people. But then the actual episodes, that's more interesting than whether or not the visual overlay is there. Because, yeah, sometimes you'll all see the dolphins. But the dolphin, for example, there's a myth in the Amazon about like the dolphin and like fertility. Like virgins shouldn't swim in the spawning grounds of pink dolphins or they'll become impregnated by the pink dolphin. And so there's this whole mythology around like the separation between the animal kingdom and the human kingdom, and this weird way in which dolphins, for a lot of people, represent the almost like, it's like another missing link. It's like, gorillas or apes or monkeys. It's like there's something about them that is like sort of hyper intelligent and self-aware. And so everyone starts having a vision about how thin the boundary is between our consciousness and other, species on the planet, and all around the theme of this, this myth, which none of us even knew about until the shaman tells us the next day. Oh yeah, that particular Icaro is about the pink river dolphin, and there's this myth about not breeding with them, even though it's sort of tempting for women because the dolphins are like very intelligent and all this stuff. So the shared visions are often visions of archetypal significance, though the visuals themselves are multivalent. Some people experience the difference between the species as something like a memory of them and their dog when they're little and feeling really connected to their dog, whereas someone else is having an experience literally about the dolphin, and it's more like they're unpacking the actual mythology of the Amazon. Someone else could be having something totally different, but the archetype is all vibrating on sort of the same level.
Wow, that is fascinating. So how did you integrate this with your Christian beliefs?
Well, for me, like that is what is ultimately like at the core of the Christian gospel. Like if you read the Christian gospel, having had an actual experience of the presence of universal archetypes, and the sort of eternal nature of these archetypes is, I mean, if there is like, you see people in these ceremonies that are literally like falling on their knees, crying out to God. And it's not because they're a religious person. It's because they are experiencing something so universal and profound that the statement like, my God is real. It's like a true recognition of some sort of divinity that exists throughout the cosmos or whatever. Well, at the core of the Christian gospel is here's this avatar who came and was, people were kind of hoping that this figure would be like a king. And here he is sort of rejecting that title and saying like, no, like I am at one with this sort of Abba, this father figure, this father like sort of patriarchal God figure. And to say I'm at one with this figure, and also to have disciples and, basically to be teaching them like follow what I'm doing. At the core of that is I think a rather esoteric teaching, but it's also really obvious. It's just saying, look, all of us are basically have a divine spark in us. And grace is the realization that all of these archetypes that we experience, greed, lust, feeling separate from nature, or all of these different things that we go through and the many different ways in which they express themselves. Grace is the realization, or salvation is the realization that that ultimately every single one of those experiences is unified. Like it's somehow all running together in a matrix of consciousness and meaning. And the more that we step into the realization of that, the more our heart opens. And when our heart opens, we just become like nicer people, and the world becomes like just a generally easier place to live in. And to me, that's what Christ consciousness is. And it's really simple. And then that was like what the ayahuasca experience showed me. So I was like, well, geez, this whole like Christian, all of the doctrine and the theological debate about scriptures, I mean, have one or two of these experiences, and in a sense, you just never want to get engaged with one of those discussions again, because the truth of what you're dealing with is so beautiful and so unified that it's just like, what can you do but try to become more Christ-like, or more Buddha-like, or you also start to realize that it seems that the human species is on some path of learning how to love, and that occasionally we get little injections from the universe of these teachers who come in different cultural hubs. Like, I think Jesus was one of the most profound teachers, not because he had anything to say that was new, but because where he was replanting the doctrine of this universality was in a place, I think, that had become greatly alienated, struggling to survive in the middle of the desert, and super alpha male. And I think all of that stuff was kind of at the core of a growing, a sort of growing male-heavy, market-centric, worldview that was about to be perpetuated. And so inject Jesus into the middle of it, because whether it's the savior or not, you have to. It's sort of like the fact that right as Hitler was taking power, the Dalai Lama was born. So it's like one of those weird paradoxes of how the flower of humanity grows.
Sure. So, can you speak a little bit about how your father recepted these kind of activities after you had gone to the Amazon?
Yeah, sure. Well, at first it was like the very first thing that happened was he was really excited to be able to talk to someone again about his psychedelic experiences. In the meantime, he was having, in his church work, he was just at burnout level. Like, his idealism was sort of, I think, a little shot. He had taken on a lot over 25 years of doing the work in the church, and he was starting to have a nervous breakdown. He was on antidepressants, and he'd even started around. He had this one big breakdown where he was cutting himself with a hunting knife, and he was just really, really having a tough go of it. And it all kind of started to turn once I had these experiences. And I literally one day just approached my dad, and I was like, Dad, my whole rebellion was based on not understanding you, because I didn't feel like you ever told me what the hell you were doing and why you were doing it. I want to know more about why you do what you do. I want to know more about why you never went back to psychedelics. I want to know like if you wish you would have. Like I just got really, really real with my dad, and it like it wasn't like in one conversation we just but throughout the course of like a year worth of having this dialogue, and I think him being sort of worried for a little bit that I had like just taken a dive into some other dimension to completely but then little by little he really was very receptive to it, and the big opening happened one summer. Salvia was becoming like a real big deal.
Okay.
And I was into smoking the extract. I did that a few times, though I quickly found that like not all plant medicines are compatible with one another. Like if you're doing like serious work with like one plant medicine, I feel like you have to be real sensitive to the teacher. The plant teachers sometimes get a little turf, like they can get into like turf fights over who's going to be like your mentor.
Really?
They don't always. I mean, like I know people who work with multiple plant teachers, but like for me, there's some serious psychic disturbance if I switch radio stations. So like I was able to smoke salvia, but I felt like I felt really disoriented from the sort of ayahuasca frequency. And then a couple of other experiments that I did, and I sort of like Carlos Castaneda's teacher talking about how you have to be careful because plant spirits are sometimes possessive of you when you become their student. So there's something to that, but at any rate, my dad decided to try salvia with me one summer, and we smoked like in the woods, and well, he smoked and I watched over him, and it was like the most, he was like trying to crawl out of this like kind of up this ravine that we were like, he was like laying in, and he was like trying to crawl out of it, and he was like kind of freaking out, and then when he was done, he was telling me the story of what he saw. He had seen like this white picket fence surrounding a white house, and it represented like the perfect family and the perfect life, and like he was trying to like get over the fence, and and feeling like he just wanted to give up, and it was just like really moving experience, vision that he had. And he had pointed up at me, like during the vision, he like actually pointed at my head, and he goes, "There's a bear." And I was like, "Huh, that's interesting." When I was born, my dad and mom had given me the Native American power totem animal of the bear. And I was like, it was super interesting that he would point up at me and say that, and because immediately I was like, well, that's my power animal. My dad's pointing at my head, and I was like, no, I'm not a bear, Dad. Like. At any rate, after that, we just there was a couple more psychedelic experiences. He started turning me on to the Beach Boys music, which I had never heard from the late 60s, early 70s. Like I knew the Beach Boys up until Pet Sounds, but after Pet Sounds, I didn't know that they had this whole dimension of like, hanging out with Charles Manson and like doing a lot of acid, and Brian Wilson went crazy. And I listened to a ton of their music with him while smoking a lot of grass, and he started. It was weird. Like the Beach Boys provided us for like this very like happy space to discuss some rather cosmic things about our relationship. And it just sort of started unfolding, and eventually, he experienced the medicine. I don't want to say too much, so I don't want to ruin it for people in the book, but he ended up experiencing ayahuasca, and it really helped him to get out of the church work altogether. And now he's doing a PhD in Jungian depth psychology at Pacifica. So, I mean, it's just like a total revolution, to watch him reinvent the psychedelic worldview, to leave the church and to be studying Carl Jung it just like blows my mind.
Wow. I had a question for you, Adam. In your book, you talked about the transition from the Amazon to I guess, America, and their use of ayahuasca. And can you talk a little bit about that and why you did that?
I'm sorry. Could you ask that one more time? That cut out.
Oh, sorry. In your book, you talked about how you went from the Amazon and taking ayahuasca to, I think it was America. And can you talk a little bit about why you did that and your views on using the ayahuasca kind of out of context from the Amazon?
Yeah. I mean, I started primarily because I ran out of money, and that's something that's a very real part about the whole ayahuasca tourism industry is that to even, I know people like think it's a real dirty word to even talk about ayahuasca tourism, but we're talking about two things. One, we're talking about how the use of the medicine in cultures in Peru or communities in Peru is affecting and creating hierarchies, affecting the people, and also it's building things. So it's a mixed bag. Like you see some really cool things being built in the way of civil society in some of these communities. Simultaneously, you see you see power structures developing, people with more money than others, that it's more distinct than it was before. But on the other end of that is just the pure, this is a really powerful, life-changing experience. And to my mind, there's not really a value you can place on it in terms of a dollar amount. So going to Peru to have this experience is definitely worth your $2,000 or $3,000 vacation. At the same time, most people can't really afford a $2,000 or $3,000 vacation. And some of the people that would benefit from it the most, like people in the middle class and lower classes of economics, that are really burdened by some of the way that society is set up. And so that is one of the reasons why I believe that it is appropriate for us to be trying to bring this tradition around the world. For one thing, it's just green. It's not costing so much money. It's not wasting oil. It's much more green to bring a shaman up and put him through a tour of like retreat centers and yoga studios around the country where people can go and learn about this medicine for $200 or $300 or even $100 as opposed to $3,000 or something like that. And so that's a good thing, I think, even though it's the ethics of it not being totally legal. And there have been some great legal advancements, the Santa Daime and the UDV. But just to know that that this is happening. I mean, it's like civil rights, and so many other. I mean, it's only going to happen if we make it happen. And that's a little Aquarian of me to say. It's a little rebellious, but it's true, and it has to be done within, we don't want to reinvent the wheel either, though. So, and that's something I've experienced here in the U.S. Sure, it's green, it's eco-friendly or whatever to have it here as opposed to there in some ways, but then the other thing is that you have a lot of hucksters, and I've noticed the general quality of shamanic mastery is more, it's more evolved or advanced in the Amazon in a lot of ways, but you get the problem of kind of wannabe shamans. I was a part of a group, at one point that was basically almost like a church youth group version of ayahuasca. It was every single person would take a turn with the talking stick, singing their own song and doing their own thing, and really not a good idea when you're drinking a ton of ayahuasca to let people express themselves, egotistically when they don't have a good control over their ego. And it was, it was all under the banner of let's share each other and everything like that. And, you have people singing, songs that are coming from, they're singing a Rolling Stones song because they think they're expressing themselves, but everyone else is experiencing their sexual frustration. It's or whatever. So it's, that was I had to work my way around until I found a place that was really solid, but and that's treacherous because I had nights where I literally had to come home and sit at the bottom of my shower and breathe for a couple of hours because I was wow, that was not the right circle to go to. So it's it is a little bit of a treacherous thing, but regardless if it's treacherous or not, it seems to be happening.
So there seems to be quite a few, as you've described. I've never really heard of very many in America, but it sounds
well, I don't know, maybe just because I'm in New York City, but I know that the coasts for sure I don't want to say too much, but right. It's all over. There's probably a circle you could get involved in within a state or two away, at least once a month, all year round.
Wow.
So it's it's also I think there's a lot of really good work being done on a lot of different fronts for the medicinal use of ayahuasca, and I really believe that within our lifetime, obviously it's sort of, the experience is medicinal if it's done in the right context, but sort of proving that it's medicinal, all these studies that are being done with mushrooms at Johns Hopkins and NYU, and some of the Iboga studies that have been done, any of that kind of stuff is going to help and get to a place where we might be able to protect this as some sort of religious sacrament, like the Daime was able to do, or the UDV. I think there's great hope for that. It should be interesting. Next year, there's another book coming out on ayahuasca and the personal transformational experience of drinking ayahuasca by a buddy of mine whose name is Josh Radnor, and he's the star of this sitcom called How I Met Your Mother.
Oh, okay. Wow.
And so I think my book I think is done well, and it's a great book. But the more that this comes out, the more that people start to see this, Josh's book is of course going to get a ton of press. He just had a movie that won Sundance's Audience Award, and so to have more celebrities talking about it, writing books about it. It sort of seems to me like we're on the front of another yoga sort of migrating around the world. And of course the ceremonies can range from all levels of intensity. So I can go on a Tuesday or Wednesday night and do a 4 or 5 hour ceremony and be back and ready for work the next day. There's other types of ceremonies where, I'm going to need a week of just staring at the wall,
When we were, this isn't on the air yet, but we recently interviewed Steve Byer, author of Singing to the Plants, and he said something along the lines of that ayahuasca, is kind of the trendy, transgressive, hallucinogen of the moment, and that he kind of felt that maybe that might pass, and that in the future something like Iboga might take its place. How do you feel about that?
I don't know. I don't think so. Well, I love Steven. He blurbed the back of my book and came to we did the monologues together last year, and his book is in terms of anthropological, and he's also just a charming narrator, but his book is, I think, one of the most comprehensive books written about Amazonian shamanism that we have. Probably maybe the best. But I would disagree a little bit, but I can't, I've never taken Iboga, so it's I'm limited in my answer, but I would say that the intensity and the duration of Iboga are much longer, and most people say harder, it's a more difficult experience, and I can't even, it's hard for me to even imagine that, but what I think is really accessible about ayahuasca is that it is short lasting, relative to Iboga, for just comparing these two. And I also believe that there is something about ayahuasca that is it's like the spirit of the medicine seems really excited and eager to migrate. Like, it's the only plant energy that I've encountered so far that seems on some kind of mission of its own. I don't get that same feeling about other plant medicines yet, that they are on a like, I mean, have we ever in the history of, you know, the modern world or whatever, seen a plant spirit that seems so, you know, energetically, actively on some sort of crusade to teach the world something? And that's just coming straight from like the plant. Like, forget people's interest in it, and just think about what the plant itself seems to be trying to do. And I haven't heard people talk about Iboga in that same way, so I would kind of be doubtful of it. At the same time, I don't really see like what's his name, Jonathan Goldman, who's the guy who's the padrino of the church in Oregon for the Santo Daime that was legalized. He talked about, will the Santo Daime, for example, ever become like a worldwide phenomenal religion like Christianity or something like that? He said no, because the work is too demanding. I mean, and myself being someone who for the past 2 years has participated in, you know, an average of maybe 30 ceremonies a year or so, I feel that that's true. Like my life is very much centered around the homework that I get from the medicine. It's a working relationship. And the deeper that a person gets to know the medicine, the more demanding the requirements are in terms of what you have to contribute to this evolutionary project. They become more demanding personally. Like, you have to walk a finer line of personal integrity. You walk out of that line and it hurts. It's more painful than it was before. And so it's not as a punishment. It was just because you've raised your level of sensitivity and your heart's open wider. So when you make egotistical mess ups just are more painful. And with all of that, I think a lot of people can kind of check out. So I think it's really two things. Like, I think ayahuasca is going to remain a really big deal and become even, bigger and more, more people will be drinking and talking about it. I think it could grow. But I think that you're going to see more of a divide within the spiritual communities themselves, whereas we all kind of used to be like, we're all sort of spiritual and opening our minds and hearts and whatever. I think we're going to discover that once the world is open, the sensationalism around the fact that this spiritual world exists at all, will sort of go, that'll die down. And what'll start to happen is we'll discover new binaries, new dualisms within that world. You'll start to see that psychic pyrotechnics, like, not to get too dark or heavy, but witchcraft. What is witchcraft? It's nothing more than like like when I had those MRSA boils, for example, I was told by the medicine that those were a form of astral STD. That was and it was primarily because on the internet I was blogging a ton about psychedelics and doing it in a super sort of sexualized way, trying to like be thought of as like this super hip psychonaut to use it to attract women. And the medicine just straight up told me like, oh, well, this was generated through like negative energy coming in through you sexually through the astral. Like, whether or not that's true, I was like, well, I'm going to test it out by no longer doing that. And I've never had one since.
Wow, really?
Wow.
So, I mean, like those kinds of like that level of like, we're going to start learning about how to do things in the astral and be less impressed with the fact that it exists. So it's like the whole drama of what goes on in these worlds, of what healing techniques work and what don't, of like the world's being open. The second step, in my opinion, is to start learning its languages, and there's all sorts of binaries that can come up through that. Like, is how involved is your ego? What sorts of what sorts of power trips do people get on once this world is no longer a novelty?
Yeah, I mean, do you think that we, I don't know, that we need to almost develop some kind of like training centers to train people how to use ayahuasca more effectively, or?
Well, that's one thing that, I mean, I joined I became a member of the Santo Daime about a year and a half ago, and for me, that's one of the reasons that I love the format of the Daime, is because the Daime is like the Daime is a really democratic model. You know, there's not a centralized shamanic figure. There's perhaps a padrino or a madrina that sit at the center table, but everyone in the circle is facing in toward this three-tiered cross and candles and flowers, and so the energy is all being focused, including the person who's leading the songs, but everyone's singing. It's all being centralized in toward a center point, like a drishti in a meditation. So that is something that I think is the way of the future, in my opinion, because it is taking out of the equation an expert, and you're trying to get a group vibration, and that's it's very Aquarian, you know, and like, and B, it's like it just takes out of the entire dynamic potential. I mean, there's a whole system of like how to address problems within the current or within the group dynamic. And so that you don't ever have to deal with like it's very Protestant in that way. Like, you're sort of taking the priest as medium to God, like right out of the equation. And I think that's how it's got to go, because in there is training that happens about how to manage yourself, because you have to do it alongside of 40, 50 other people all at the same time. In order to make sure the container is strong and holds everyone has to do their part. And that kind of egalitarian training ground for holding yourself in the medicine has a certain kind of integrity built into it that's, I think it just bypasses some of the problems of the individualized training.
Well, if anyone would like to purchase your book, Adam, where would you direct them?
Right. I would tell them to, it's Fishers of Men, the Gospel of an Ayahuasca Vision Quest. Obviously my name's Adam Elenbaas, so you can just search my name or the book on Amazon. Obviously, if you can try to buy it new and not used, that definitely helps Tarcher, which is a great publishing house, and the publishing houses are not, it's not in total danger, but it's like the book industry is not doing well. So at the same time, I feel terrible, because obviously I love used bookstores too. So and then if not, you can go to my website, fishersofmenbook.com. There's some audio interviews, and I'll put this audio up on the website too, if you guys are cool with that. And
absolutely,
yeah, most definitely.
And yeah, they can go there. The other thing, if you're interested in like my other side project, you can go to nightlightastrology.com. That's kind of what I'm up to these days. I've started an astrology practice and a study course here in the city. We're opening up our own little studio space, sort of astrological center for both walk-in clients and public education in April. So lots of cool things happening there too, and it's been fun to talk to people about, in the astrological world, about how a plant teaches about the planets. It's a fascinating, whole different conversation. Maybe we'll talk about that some other time.
Yeah, I was gonna say, oh my gosh, that sounds amazing.
Yeah. No, I totally forgot about that. I actually looked at that website and I thought it was really interesting. I was like, oh, I wonder what he's up to.
Yeah, it's been really fast growth. We've seen like 6 months that we've opened, we've seen over 300 clients. We have 20 students enrolled in the training study program, and like I said, we're about to open a center here, so it's just really taking off quickly.
That's awesome. Well, Adam, thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, guys, thanks for having me. You guys have a great show, and please let me know when you guys are doing new things, and I'll be sure to ping it out to all the people that I'm in touch with.
Oh, great. Thanks, Adam.
Thanks, man.
If you enjoyed this episode of Cosmic Echo and would like to learn more about Adam and his work, please visit our website at taileaters.com /CE podcast, and there you can find links to his books as well as additional links to his work. Additionally, if you would be interested in supporting our podcast, you can do so through the Patreon page, which is located at the same website. We look forward to bringing you additional episodes in the near future, but until then, happy dreaming.